Welcome to our third webinar in a series of 4, and this one is around modern slavery. How does it link with schools in the UK? How does it link with suppliers in the UK and internationally, as well as local and international supply chains as well? So thank you so much for coming along for this session. Really excited to share the information we have with you and really excited to hear your questions and to answer them. Feel free to ask questions throughout the session. It's very relaxed, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can at the end of the session, but fantastic to see you all today from such an international audience as well. So before we start the session, a little bit about myself. My name is Yuan Chen, and my background is actually primarily within the space of supply chain human rights due diligence, especially encountering slavery and human trafficking in businesses globally. And I've helped businesses that have been spread out across not only the Asia Pacific, but also the European and America regions. Or since I've joined ValueMatch, I've played a key role in developing and driving our sustainability benchmarking services, certainly our human rights training and supply chain services. I also lead our internal human rights strategy, and I lead the sustainable schools assessment service that we do at ValueMatch. So it's great to be with you all today. So happy to see you all. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say and what you have to think about the session. Some little facts about me over my time. I've done risk mapping for human rights risks across around 1.5 billion in supply chain spend and 4,000 suppliers. And the trainings that I've developed and conducted from, frontline to board level staff have resulted in an average of about 60% increase in awareness of modern slavery, as well as a 90% satisfaction rate. So this is the background that I come from. So really excited to be with you all today. So going into the agenda of the session, we're going to be covering what is modern slavery and human trafficking, and actually defining it. We'll be covering how widespread it is, particularly within the UK, as that's the context that we're mainly addressing in this session. We'll be covering where might you encounter modern slavery, why should we care about it from different angles, as well as recommendations for businesses, schools, and wider private sector around what they can do to combat it. So firstly, what is modern slavery and human trafficking? So modern slavery is actually an umbrella term that covers a variety of crimes, such as those that are on screens, like human trafficking, debt bondage, forced labor, sex exploitation, child labor, forced criminality. This is not the full list, but these are just some examples. So at its fundamental level, Anti-Slavery International Anti-Slavery International's definition phrases it quite well. So modern slavery is when an individual is exploited by others for either personal and or commercial gain. So, whether they're tricked, coerced, or forced, they lose their freedom. And based on this common definition, every case of modern slavery can be broken down into roughly 2 components. The means of exploiting someone, and which means, how a person is controlled, such as withholding their documents or threatening them and their family, emotional or physical abuse, etc. The other part is the purpose on the screen, which is the purpose is always for personal and or financial gain. And the 2 of them together make up a modern slavery scenario, where a person is controlled for someone else's gain. So while this definition does cover technically the transatlantic style of slavery that was abolished a couple hundred years ago, mainly chattel slavery, transatlantic slavery is of a different time and period where it was publicly conducted and very overt and obvious. On the other hand, modern slavery is often hidden and covers a wider array of criminal activities. So while this deck is about modern slavery, it's also about exploitation more generally. So it's actually quite helpful to view exploitation as a continuum rather than just viewing it as being between enslaved and not enslaved. Overall, when we're enforcing human rights standards within business practices, we're covering a wide variety of issues that could make a situation either decent work or outright forced labor. These kinds of issues could cover areas like unpaid and excessive overtime as well, inadequate accommodation, poor health and safety standards, verbal or physical abuse, union busting activities. There's lots of other items, but these are just some examples among the many areas. So while all violations of labor standards should be taken seriously, the more of these different violations are present, the more vulnerable a situation becomes to becoming forced labor and total loss of freedom. So how widespread is modern slavery and human trafficking? So Worldwide, based on the Global Slavery Index from 2021, this is quite a widely cited estimation of prevalence of modern slavery. This states that in 2021, 50 million people were estimated to be in situations of modern slavery on any given day globally. Of the 50 million, 17.3 were exploited within the private sector. And on top of that, the International Labor Organization estimates that modern slavery makes at least 150 billion US dollars in profits each year, proving to be a very lucrative crime. And given the hidden nature of this crime and its control over people, the numbers of, not only profit but also potential victims could be much higher in actuality. So, looking specifically to the UK, because that's where our main audience is based, in terms of UK prevalence, the Global Slavery Index, the previous one that we referenced, estimates that the UK has roughly 122,000 victims as of the 2021 estimate. This estimate is actually updated every 5 years or so, with the last one being in 2016. However, based on the statistics of the National Referral Mechanism, this gives us a much more concrete and conservative view of prevalence in the UK. So 2023, we saw about 17,004 referrals of potential victims into what's called the National Referral Mechanism, or the NRM. Most of these were determined by competent authorities to be victims of modern slavery. And where I've highlighted text in red on screen is to actually bring home a point. So firstly, people think that modern slavery is a foreign issue in countries with less rule of law or less wealth. This is actually proven wrong, in that the largest proportion of victims in the UK are British citizens. This year, duty to notify referrals were the highest ever recorded, and a duty to notify referral means that information of a potential victim is passed on to the NRM, but the adult potential victim in question doesn't consent to be referred into the NRM for support. The highest number of the duty to notifies, or DTNs, means that the highest number of adult potential victims have refused to be referred for support, which actually puts them at serious risks of being not only re-trafficked, but not having safe accommodations or legal advice. So it presents a serious risk. Finally, the number of child potential victims referred in 2023 is the highest on record since the NRM was established. And this is actually incredibly concerning, given that children are often exploited for crimes like drugs trafficking, drugs cultivation. And in 2023, the majority of County Lines referrals, which is children used to traffic drugs in the UK, was 74% made up of male children, unfortunately. So you've already had some clues, but where could we encounter modern slavery? So when it comes to modern slavery, schools are particularly at risk for three main areas. So students can be at risk to exploitation forms like criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation, particularly. Criminal exploitation can include forms of crime like drugs cultivation, drugs trafficking, notably county lines, as I mentioned previously, and involvement with criminal gangs. And based on a report from ECPAT, students who have parents that are absent, perhaps due to having to work multiple jobs because of a poorer socioeconomic background, those kinds of kids can be more at risk of being exploited by gangs because of a lack of supervision. Based on a report from The Guardian as well, many children are becoming more and more at risk due to the cost of living crisis. Additionally, things like absenteeism from school or exclusion from school can also present increased risks. And we put the link to this report for you in the slides so that you can look at it in more detail when we send out the slides afterwards. Schools can also be at risk of exposure to modern slavery through their staff, especially if they work in high-risk roles or services. These staff can be staff of suppliers, or recruitment agencies, or the school's own staff. One case study in 2018 actually had an exploitation victim cleaning a college and she was working from 3 a.m. to 11 p.m., sleeping in an empty storage room. And she did all this because she feared for the lives of her children who were at risk. So modern slavery can actually be much closer than you think. And the final area is that supply chains of schools and of suppliers can be at risk of modern slavery exposure, especially within high-risk procurements and supplies. This is especially relevant of a problem as a report from The Grocer in 2024 said that organizations like schools lack the resources and legal power to address exploitation threats in their supply chains. So this is actually the topic of our next section. So on screen, I have a few of the high-risk sectors that are notable. So now, based on what you know, please feel free to pop in the chat which sectors do you feel schools or your business can be exposed to for modern slavery risk. So please feel free to pop your thoughts in the chat for which sectors you think are most at risk. Textiles, all right. Construction, yes, certainly, Teresa. And see a lot of people typing in the chat. This is great. Manufacturing, agriculture. Yep. So good to know. All of these are correct answers, but there are more as well. So according to Nottingham University Human Rights Lab research, sectors like IT, audiovisual equipment, lab and office consumables, food catering supplies, and textiles for things like uniforms, these are high-risk goods procured by education institutions like universities and schools. And so broadly speaking, these sectors would be covered by the highlighted sectors on screen. So whether directly or indirectly, schools and suppliers are very exposed to high-risk supply chains for modern slavery. So in particular, I've chosen 4 sectors to analyze for case studies, which highlight the risk drivers which are often common across high-risk sectors. These factors can be areas like, but not exclusive to, non-public facing work. So employees may work during non-peak times or in places where the public may not be likely to spot them. High-risk sectors can also rely on largely a migrant workforce. And while migrants are not themselves a problem, they have risks because they may not know their working rights, they may not speak the local language very well, which places them in a very vulnerable position sometimes. Additionally, there's also risks with seasonal working visa schemes, especially in the care and agricultural sectors for food, according to research from the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Center from March 2024. So these sectors may not tend to pay as much to workers in low-skilled professions, which can be contributive to overtime or debt bondage in some cases. And this is actually somewhat linked to low skill as well, as the seasonality of business means that recruiting processes may need to be conducted quicker, and recruiting due diligence can have corners cut sometimes at the expense of speed. So that's a significant risk as well. So in terms of some general case study examples, in October last year in the textile sector, workers in Leicester were striking against poor safety standards and poor labor standards. Issues within the textile sector in Leicester have been ongoing since 2019, certainly even earlier, but have only been highlighted then. There's also been major strikes in the Bangladeshi garments industry, particularly around worker pay and minimum wage pay. The government actually, unfortunately, opened fire on protesters last year and cracked down on union leaders. So that's a significant risk. Within food processing, we've seen Ukrainian workers exploited on UK farms. We've also seen child labor risk increasing within the US meat processing industry. Within cleaning and facilities management, worker conditions were quite poor during the pandemic with a lot of risks due to insecure employment contracting conditions. Ukrainians are also exploited within the cleaning business in the UK. And furthermore, within construction, with the influx of Albanian migrants, construction firms are at risk of recruiting people who are working within the underground economy. And on top of that, with the push for renewable sector commodities and energy production, the UK actually risks being a dumping ground for solar components made by forced labor from China due to relatively more relaxed regulations compared to other countries. So these are just some examples that you can take a look at later when we send the slides. So why should we care about modern slavery? At different levels, at a very broad view, there's 3 reasons why we should be working to mitigate modern slavery risks and exploitation risks. So modern slavery often impacts the most vulnerable demographics, such as women, children, refugees, asylum seekers, and even ethnic minorities as well. And because of how the freedom of individuals is taken away when being exploited, those who are being exploited often become more and more entrenched in their exploitation. And this is most obvious in cases where debt bondage is present. So by combating labor exploitation, before we get to the point of forced labor, we protect vulnerable individuals and give them the best chances at decent work to lift themselves out of precarity. So if we further broaden our view, there's a high prevalence of where we see high levels of exploitation, we usually see lack of rule of law, lack of opportunities, and lack of safety and support. So where there's prevalence, there's also can be a high prevalence of drugs trafficking, forced criminality, and money laundering. So going into specific case studies, involving state-imposed modern slavery, such as the Chinese mass internment and crackdown on Xinjiang, entire ethnic community groups can be subject to systematic oppression and displacement. So by combating modern slavery and supply chains, we help to prevent funding these crimes as well. And finally, in the worst cases, modern slavery can actually threaten geopolitical security. An investigation during the pandemic found that the UK had accidentally sourced PPE from factories that used North Korean forced laborers that could potentially be providing money towards nuclear proliferation financing in North Korea, which is extremely risky. So, and on a last point on the right-hand side of the screen, finally, combating modern slavery promotes thriving communities where businesses and procurement can be done and drives, improvement in multiple sustainable development goals. All of these things also contribute to the UK social value government goals as well. So, combating modern slavery also helps to protect the environment. So, whilst large-scale systematic studies of the relationship between modern slavery and climate change are still to be researched, individual case studies over the last 50 years show that there's definitely a precedent for the link. And at a very high level, climate change and modern slavery have a two-way relationship in that climate change can drive displacement, which increases vulnerability. And as people become involved in exploitative businesses, these exploitative enterprises may often use environmentally unfriendly practices, which exacerbates climate change even more. This is a significant risk given that the World Bank estimates that over 140 million people will be displaced by climate change and could be at risk. So due diligence measures such as supply chain mapping, adverse media searching, and supplier onboarding processes can be used to not only screen for human rights risks, but also climate change related risks to do with a supplier. So now, while local businesses in the UK should be more concerned with UK legislation, we do have international reaching organizations in the audience today, so I will give some overview of the international regulations as well that can also influence the UK landscape. So from a legislative angle, over the last 10 years, there's been an increasingly regulatory focus on modern slavery mitigation. So at a broad international level, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights outline some general principles that businesses have a responsibility to understand and prevent certain risks and remedy them, regardless of their size and location. Other pieces of legislation have been created following the spirit of the UN Guiding Principles, or the UNGPs, such as the Modern Slavery Act 2015, the United States Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act 2021, the German Supply Chain Act, or LKSG, in 2023, and the European Union Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, EU CS3D, which was implemented not that long ago. So all of these mandate certain due diligence measures or reporting requirements around human rights risks within business operations. And this is something that's going to become increasingly the case as we go forward. So looking specifically at the UK Modern Slavery Act, these are the general requirements. It mandates businesses with over 36 million in annual turnover to publish a modern slavery statement with specific sections such as the structure and supply chains, policies relating to modern slavery, due diligence processes, risk assessment, KPIs for progress measurement, and training on modern slavery. Currently, there's no enforcement measures or penalties for non-compliance, unfortunately, but Parliament has been suggesting changes to the Act, which broadly means businesses will have to disclose where they're sourcing goods and services from. They'll have to arrange for audits and inspections, and there may be fines of 4% of global turnover and up to £20 million in fines if non-compliance is discovered. So this is something we have to be aware of, that these changes could be happening. So while much of the legislative focus is on larger businesses, this is still very much a concern for SMEs or small and medium-sized enterprises. The private sector will have to comply with all of these new requirements, especially larger businesses. And part of those requirements will actually be cascading down to suppliers that are SMEs and suppliers to the larger private sector companies. So furthermore, businesses that are implicated in exploitation and modern slavery cases can face huge reputational damage. So both reputation damage and failure to account for modern slavery can cause material impacts like loss of business or loss of investment. So it's a significant risk. So from a public sector perspective, public procurement is increasingly emphasizing social values importance within supply chains. SMEs that want to gain public contracts will need to be demonstrating how they're driving positive social impact. And naturally, failing to mitigate for modern slavery risks is actually very much in opposition to upholding positive social value. Sorry. So, and beyond the legislation and the regulation, I believe that there's a universal responsibility on all of us to use whatever capacity we have to uphold the dignity of people. One of my favorite stories exemplifying this is that of Ho Feng Shan. He's dubbed the Chinese Schindler for his role in saving thousands of Austrian Jews by granting them passage to China to escape Nazi persecution in 1938. He was actually instructed by his superiors not to issue visas to Austrian Jews as to maintain good relations between the Republic of China and Germany. So, while disobeying his superiors' orders would be a betrayal of his duty to the consulate, obeying it meant that for him, he would betray his heart and deny the wishes of thousands of innocent people on the brink of death. So, like Ho Feng Shan, none of us can say we didn't know about the evil in the world taking place, but each of us has a say in what we're going to do about it moving forward. So now I have 6 main recommendations that are applicable for different ways between schools, SMEs, and larger businesses, both internationally and locally. So first one, have a modern slavery statement if your business has a turnover above 36 million pounds. Organizations, both suppliers and schools, have to have modern slavery statements if they have 36 million or more in turnover. If you are starting to reach that threshold soon, do consider preparing a statement to be compliant ahead of meeting that threshold to stay ahead of the curve. While SMEs technically aren't legally obliged to have a statement if they're below threshold, it's important to have an approach to mitigating modern slavery and human trafficking that is not only proportionate, but appropriate to your size of operation, as you may be queried on this in tenders in the public sector in the UK. This is something that Value Match asks for in our own procurement processes as well. Secondly, ensure that procurements factor for modern slavery risks and compliance. Both schools and larger suppliers should have systems in place to identify and address risks in supply chains relating to modern slavery. Procurements should be requiring potential suppliers to either provide a copy of their modern slavery statement if they have one, or provide an outline of their approach to preventing modern slavery risks. So it's important that procurement staff have knowledge of risks in particular sectors or commodities being procured to understand if a potential supplier addresses risks appropriately. Relating to SMEs, while they do have significantly less ability to mandate these kinds of requirements, something that's important to do is to understand how a supplier provides the prices that they can, especially if the prices seem a bit too good to be true. SMEs should also be asking questions around modern slavery measures of their own suppliers, as that sends a message that modern slavery is an important issue to the sector. Thirdly, consider how your school or business can use procurements to lessen vulnerability to modern slavery. At Value Match, we've actually been using procurement contracts to get suppliers to commit to provide job and apprenticeship opportunities to students and local communities. Things like we've been able to set up breakfast clubs using savings achieved from efficient contracting to ensure children have a meal before school and can focus on their education. Things like setting up secondhand uniform procurement schemes. We've done this in the past, and this has really helped to alleviate financial pressure on families who may otherwise struggle to buy first-hand uniforms, especially in the cost of living crisis. Modern slavery is actually often symptomatic of larger issues of inequality, lack of good opportunities, and good support. So every little bit helps when it comes to alleviating risk and minimizing inequality. Providing role-specific training down on the left-hand side of the screen. It's important that staff that work in procurement are given the training needed to identify and prevent risks within their area of focus. So this means understanding risks within sectors or commodities, what the latest best practice is, and what to do if a risk is identified. And for SMEs, general awareness training around modern slavery usually goes a very long way, as role-specific training may be slightly too detailed for your size of operation. Additionally, teachers in schools already have training around things like safeguarding and prevent in the UK. Teachers are crucial as they're a front line in engaging and intervening for students. So training staff and updating them on upcoming risks, especially teachers, knowing about upcoming risks is incredibly useful. So training is actually an area that Value Match can certainly support in, so please get in touch if you have any questions. We've also attached a QR code to a general awareness training video that we've created as a resource for organizations that just want to get started or refresh your memory. Operating to the prompt payment code. For all organizations, signing up and operating according to the UK government's prompt payment code is really important, as it helps to ensure that all businesses being procured from are paid on time and have reliable cash flow to pay workers and other suppliers on time as well. Late payments and poor practice in this area can really have significant knock-on effects both locally and internationally. So please prevent it by signing the prompt payment code and operating to it. And finally, share knowledge and awareness. If you see news of a particular risk arising, share it with your network, your business partners, and even your suppliers as well. Knowledge sharing helps to cover for blind spots that we each may have and helps us to work on the problem together. So this is what we're doing at Value Match as well. So just a reminder, one of the services that we do is a social impact and improvement model assessment, which benchmarks your organization's sustainability across multiple areas, including human rights and modern slavery. And this is all to create a holistic strategy covering multiple areas. This has really helped organizations to stay ahead of legislative changes and have a competitive edge in bids. We've done this all the way for SMEs to multinational construction companies, and we've also created actionable insights through this model quite a lot. On top of that, the criteria that's set out in the methodology grades suppliers and enables success stories from case studies before. So we know that this model really works when it's systematized for procurement as well. Another area that we work in is the Sustainable Schools Assessment, which essentially aims to help schools develop strategies to steward the environment, strengthen communities, and safeguard people, because we believe that schools really have to be focusing on these areas to not only be educators within the community, but also benefit the community to the maximum of their potential. So in terms of things to be aware of, here are some signs of modern slavery and what you can do about it. And remember, these signs should be viewed in context of each situation, so keep that in mind. But if a person appears malnourished, or they have signs of physical abuse, or they have few belongings, they feel fearful and anxious, avoidant or reluctant to speak, and perhaps appear to be under someone else's control, these could be signs of exploitation. And if you see something suspicious based on those, do not approach a victim, as it puts the victim at risk and it puts yourself at risk as well. So if you're suspicious, call the Modern Slavery Helpline in the UK to ask for advice and to report. However, if someone is in very immediate danger, please call 999. These are UK specific advices, so please consult your local sources of advice if you're not living in the UK. And finally, talk to friends, family, colleagues, and clients about the issue, as we said before. Share knowledge, share latest best practice. It's always brilliant to do that and to collaborate in that way. So on screen, I have a QR code for an end of session 2-minute survey. Once again, it only takes 2 minutes to complete. It really, really helps us with giving feedback about our webinars. And if you want to give us thoughts on future webinar ideas, please let us know. So I put the QR code on the screen up there, and I'll also send it in the takeaway materials afterwards for you to give feedback. So without further ado, we have about 12 to 13 minutes left. We have a question and answer session. I realize that was a lot of information, so please feel free to send me questions through. I'll do my best to get through as many as I can, but thank you so much for coming to the session, and I hope that you found it very useful. All right. We've got one question from Chin Yap. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do you think the government should play a role in combating modern slavery? Yes, definitely. I think the main role that government plays in terms of combating modern slavery and human trafficking is mainly through the realm of legislation and law enforcement. So, like we've seen on screen with the legislative side, you have like the Modern Slavery Act, the U.S. Forced Labor, U.S. Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the EU CS3D, and the German Supply Chain Act. Those are all really important for outlining what corporate obligations and duties are. However, the shortcoming of government efforts to combat modern slavery is that they can only give a very high level overview of what businesses should be doing, but they don't give advice around how they should do it. So if your business needs help on advice on how to set up a modern slavery strategy or what kind of interventions we find are really useful, please feel free to get in touch. Always happy to chat. So, but great question though. All right. I've got a question. So at the moment, public sector tenders in the UK don't account very heavily for modern slavery. So why should we focus on it? That's a very good question. So, modern slavery and human trafficking is actually covered within the UK government social value model as a sort of sub theme within a larger theme, which is to do with equal opportunities. So, and a lot of tenders now, they will be asking for social value considerations because public sector tenders have to have at least 10 to 15% of weighting towards social value. So, social value will capture modern slavery. And in some tenders that we've seen, modern slavery specific questions are asked by public sector tenders. So it's something you definitely have to care about as an SME if you want to bid into the public sector. So I hope that answers the question. Oh, just had another one come through. So what are the most impactful first steps a business can take to combating modern slavery? I think in our experience, doing things like keeping a very accurate and up-to-date ledger of your suppliers and who you've bought from, how much you've bought from them, and what you've bought from them is really important because what you can then do is go into that information to identify where risks of modern slavery are most likely to occur and enables really targeted engagement for further risk assessment. This is something that we've been doing at Value Match ourselves as well, where we have reviewed our own supply chain and are starting to build up our own recommendations. This is a service that we're rolling out externally now. So if you're interested in this, please get in touch. We'll also be publishing our own supply chain risk mapping report either this evening or tomorrow morning. And so you can take a look and see what the output looks like, what the process looks like, and so on. So if you're interested, please get in touch. Anyone else have any other questions? I can see people typing in the chat, which is brilliant. I've just had another one come through to myself. How do you approach providing modern slavery support to clients? Um, Really, what we try to do is do a bespoke approach. We try our best to understand with the client what their context is and specifically what their business goals are. And then from there, we do our best to identify what the most bang for buck and impactful solution is in terms of services. This can be things like training, can be like reviewing bid responses related to modern slavery. It can be supply chain risk mapping, as I've mentioned before, and it can also be policy reviews as well as modern slavery statement reviews and writing. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to get in touch. Very happy to have a conversation. We've just had another question from Chinyep. Can we classify those forced to work under pig butchering schemes to be classified as MSHT, especially those forced to work in the Golden Triangle, Asia, Myanmar, and Cambodia? Yeah, there's definitely significant risks of trafficking between Myanmar, Cambodia, and China, especially. However, those if they're forced to work within pig butchering schemes, then yes, that would technically be forced labor because if you're forced, it means you don't have the freedom to either move into that job under your own choice, or if you're not allowed to leave it, then that's a denial of freedom, which constitutes modern slavery. So I would definitely classify that as modern slavery and human trafficking. But if you want to, I'm happy to have a conversation with you specifically about that and to see if there's anything we can do to support. Anybody else have any particular questions? All right. Fantastic. Well, anyways, please feel free to have back about 7 to 8 minutes of your time. Thank you so much for coming to this session. Hope you have a great rest of your day and rest of the week. Next week, we'll be hosting a session on social value and why it matters and how you can take account of it. Please feel free to join. Same day next week at exactly the same time. We'll send out more resources and information about this soon. But anyways, have a great day and take care, everyone.